And I'm happy to invite to this stage Piotr Zaitsev, the open source zealot. Woo!
The open source zealot. Do you even know what that means? No. No, I think he just speaks words from the air. Well, I'm not open source zealot. I think I'm open source realist. But yes, my background is with open source software, and I believe everything being equal, open source is better, and it is would be even better if a lot of companies and individuals invest more of their resources in improving open source software rather than, into proprietary software. Well, we are going to talk today about databases, various databases, and running them in a container, Kubernetes, right, and then as a database as your solution. So, how many of you guys are using Kubernetes here? Okay, well, fair amount of hands. And what about Docker? Any Docker users? Okay, well, I should have seen about the overlap. Okay, any developers here? Okay, and more like DBAs or SREs or kind of, ooh, so few. So few. Well, yes, there's a few of us left, right? Like running databases is hard. It's a hard work running databases. Well, anyway, let's start with the main part of the presentation. So, I personally was involved with the open source since its early days. Then things have been kind of much harder than before, right? Like if you look at open source in late 90s, right, you often would have to download the sources, maybe, patch them so they work, and particularly with your compiler, compile them, right, and so on and so forth, right? And then a few days later, you feel like a hero, what you made something work. Well, since that, we had this never-ending march towards simplicity, right? Not just with open source, but I think in general, in a world, we want things simpler, faster, easier, right? And then you can see from that downloaded sources, patch and compile, we kind of have been various stages of improvements, right? All the way to saying, hey, we can just drop a Docker container, not thinking about dependencies or whatever, and it's just works, right? So Docker, right? And that is one of the ways which makes installing database and every other software very simple. What about running database in Docker? I think there are two distinct use cases for running a database everywhere. One is what we call the test and dev, right? That's typically small databases. If you lose them, who cares, right? And then, of course, there is a production, which typically means larger, high performance, more mission critical databases. Now, if you think about the test and dev, we have seen database in Docker have been used for a very long time because it is simple and it's wonderful, right? Like, for example, you can get those very clean, easy database environments, very easy. You can spin up multiple versions of the same database, for example, on the same host without having to mess with, how do I install several MySQL, Postgres, right, over versions on my Linux box because I want to, test things for compatibility, right? So it is fantastic. But there are some also tools like Docker Compose, which you can use to spin up a whole stacks for test and dev, which have been very, very useful. Now, if you think about the production, that is where things are getting complicated. First, especially coming from its early years, Docker got a lot of fears of the overhead, saying, oh my gosh, if you run the database on Docker, it is going to be much, much slower compared to running bare metals. Mostly those fears are unfounded if you're using things right, but still, reputation tends to last for many years. There's also some extra complexities. I've seen a number of people who would accidentally lose their data, right, because they store the data in container, right, obviously like a big no-no, right, and, well, you kill container, you lost all your data instead of using data volumes. Well, that is an issue. And then also, especially with production databases, we are very much focused at the monitoring and observability, right? Because we really need to understand what's going on, and if things are not working correctly, why. Initially, many observability tools for Docker were not great, right? I think now situations have improved a lot in this regard. So what is the state of open source databases and Dockers? Well, if you think about that, most open source databases, they have a Docker images right now, and they're very commonly used for test and dev environments, while I would say direct Docker use in production is not that common. We can actually check that. Do anyone uses Docker and database in production? Here, any hands? Okay, well, we have just a couple of people. So what do we do from Percona side in this regard? Well, we have our own Docker packages for pretty much all the software at Percona, right? And our software, that typically means the enhanced enterprise grade, but still open source distributions for MySQL, MongoDB, and Postgres, which is what we do is free and open source, while with MongoDB, the core server is obviously source available, well, because the upstream is. Now, there are big unsolved problems as we look at the Docker, I think. One is day two operations. Yes, if I look at, I can deploy multiple even databases with Dockers, relatively easy, but now how to manage all that, replication, self-healing, zero downtime upgrades, backups, right, and all that kind of stuff is not really solved very well in particularly Docker ecosystem. And in many cases, this comes from what the database those days, right, even the database which is kind of designed for a single node as a MySQL or Postgres, right, you really need to think and operate in the context of a cluster or set of database instances rather than sort of like a single instance, which Docker does well. And that is where Kubernetes comes in play, right, or came in play. Now, if you think about Kubernetes and databases, or even Kubernetes and stateful systems, they kind of have a complicated relationship, right? As with many things in technology, you have something which is designed, right, for one thing, and then it's kind of migrates to other things. Like, believe me, Linux was not designed to be run on watches, right? Well, but here we go, right? If you think about Kubernetes, it was designed to run as stateless applications initially, and the databases is completely opposite, right? Database is where you store your state. So for years, you often see the pattern would be, well, we have a stateless applications in a Kubernetes, and we use databases all the way, right, on VMs, on bare metal, maybe use database as a service our cloud provider provides. Though, in this case, a lot has been improved in recent years. Now, here is also like an interesting example of an old tweet. Now it has been for years, but that was very interesting. What Casey Hightower is one of well-known in US advocates for Kubernetes, right? And even him, a couple of years ago, was not recommending that too much. So, database on Kubernetes. One of the things which have been changing in the last few years is what there was the community of many organizations formed to run their data on Kubernetes, right? That's DOK, that stands for Data on Kubernetes, right? To really advance their interest in improving Kubernetes to run run stateful application, right? And because of that, a lot of improvements have been driven, right? Like unifying the container storage interface, right? Like support for stateful set, right? And all this kind of stuff. And I wanted to share some stats from those folks. Like one, which is very interesting, is what if you look at data on Kubernetes survey, we can see what a very significant portion of respondents already run a database on Kubernetes. Well, you would say, well, it's kind of biased survey, right? Of course, you're just pulling the people who have an interest in that. So the second item, I think, is very interesting, where we can see what people are running database on Kubernetes are not only doing that, but they are pretty happy doing it. Here is another interesting stat. Right? This is actually comes the survey not from data on Kubernetes, but from CNCF survey. CNCF, this is like cloud native foundation, which is all the Docker and Kubernetes and Kubernetes ecosystem users, right? Not particularly focused on database. And what we see here is what the databases are one of the fastest growing workloads on Kubernetes, right? We see like almost 48% growth, right, in how many people start deploying that. So I think we are really reached that pivot point where a lot of people saying, hey, you know what, Kubernetes is ready to run their databases. Now, what is also interesting, if you look at many database as a service solutions, right, especially which are not run by hyperclouds, which tend to have a lot of their own technology developed for ages and ages, right? But what I would call like independent database as service solutions, like they all tend to use Kubernetes as a backend. In many cases, they don't really tell you that, because that is not really your business how you run the kitchen. But actually, if you talk to developers, they'll tell you that's what they do. And with that, we can be sure there are many, hundreds of thousands of nodes of a database, probably millions of nodes are running quite successfully on Kubernetes. Now, for those of you, and I think there have been some of you, who are not familiar with Kubernetes, what is it, right? Well, Kubernetes is, you can think about as an operating system for a data center, right? Where Linux is single computer, Kubernetes is for the operating system. Yes, it has a little bit of a different, API and kind of like a pattern you use it, but that is something to consider, right? If you think about open source databases on Kubernetes, right? Here, situation is slightly different with Docker, right? And there is a reason for that, because a lot of database vendors, they also have their own database as a service solution, and that is what we would like you to use, right? Because that is obviously a much more profitable solution if you are running something like MongoDB Atlas instead of deploying your own database on Kubernetes, right? And same applies to like Oracle Cloud than MySQL. So in many cases, you would see the third-party operators being created, and then official operator would kind of create it later, more like, well, you know what, we don't want to be kind of left behind. If you think about what Percona does, well, guess what, right? We do have, again, our operator solutions for MySQL, MongoDB, and Postgres, and we have been doing that now for many years. I think that is some of the most mature Kubernetes-focused solutions on the market. We have some of our, largest companies running them. And again, like that goes with providing typically the enhanced open enterprise-grade solutions, but in open source package, right? So that is some of the solutions what we provide. So what are the unsolved problems in a Kubernetes? One is when I say what you can screw things up in Docker by just storing things in data volumes, Kubernetes running the databases allows you screw things up even more, right? Think about that. If you don't set up anti-affinity rules properly, you may end up running all your, database replicas in the same rack and kind of, losing it all, right? When that rack loses powers, right? And things like it, right? So while it is possible, and many database as a service folks do it, it still requires that kind of level of expertise to not screw it up, and that worries a number of people. And then also the Kubernetes itself, it has this unique approach to getting things done, which can be foreign for some of people familiar with Linux ecosystem, right? That's kind of transition of a mindset required, right? Like in one conference, as I remember, I compared Kubernetes to beer, because you know what? Beer kind of tastes bitter first, right? But then as you develop, that taste, right? That can become pretty addictive, right? So that is how I would think about Kubernetes. So when you think about running, for some people who are familiar with Kubernetes, you may be very happy saying, hey, you know what, I'm just, have infrastructure as a code pattern, I define my environment in YAML file, I kind of deploy it, if I need to change it, I, change a few things, reapply it, well, fantastically, right? If you got used to more as a database as a service solution, when you have a couple of API calls, so maybe you can, click a few buttons on the interface to deploy the database. Well, you may not be quite happy with that, and you may want to get the database as a service experience, which is typically available in the cloud. And here I like to tell people we have this very much proprietary cloud solutions which come with a great usability at a great cost, both in terms of the dollars, right? It tends to be more expensive, as well as in cost in terms of you giving up your control, right? And embracing that vendor lock-in, which for open source minded people, well, we all know that is not a good thing. So if you think about their current state, the major cloud, they all have their proprietary database as a service offerings. There are also proprietary offerings by like a database vendors, like what I said, like an independent cloud. And then there's a couple of guys who are doing multi-database proprietary solution, like Avian, Instacluster, right, a few other, right? But so far, we don't have really the good open source solution yet, right, if you will. Now, why is database service in particular important? Well, of course, what that is removing a lot of toil, right? We can avoid doing a lot of things which are, well, just an overhead to keep the database running in operation, right? Which a lot of developers absolutely love and the managers love, because, well, that means developers can be more productive, right? Or whatever you call the technical team can be more productive by focus on the core business needs instead of, just I spent last month figuring out how to back up my database. Well, not particularly valuable for a business. What is also interesting with many databases as a service, they are often talk about database as a service being open source compatible, right? Think about like Amazon Aurora. Postgres is compatible with Postgres, right? Same with MySQL and so on. So, but that what I mean is what I would call is Hotel California compatibility, right? They are very much focused on making sure it's very easy to check in, but once you fully embraced those full set of additional solutions, which proprietary solution prefers, well, it will be impossible for you to check out. Believe me, they are counting on that. In many cases, it is also a solution which is kind of oversold, right? We often see people thinking like, or at least coming to us as Percon and say, well, we embraced the fully managed database as a service, right? And it was supposed to be, wonderful. We don't need to have anybody in the team who knows anything about databases, right? But then you figure out who is responsible for security. Oh, that is a shared responsibility. Oh, who is going to be responsible for my performance? Well, that's shared responsibility as well. You still have to have somebody on your team to design the schema, tune the query, right, and that kind of stuff, right? So I think that is a very important thing to understand and kind of manage your expectations. What a database is a service, they do reduce the toil, but you probably would not get the best outcomes, especially for mission-critical, high-load applications, by having no database experience whatsoever in your team, right, or somebody who's working as a part of your team. Now, the also interesting thing in this case is, well, the question of a vendor lock-in, right? What you often talk about the data and database is what the data has gravity, right? As you get your data in the cloud environment, you kind of lock yourself in, and that can be very hard and expensive to get it out, right? Why database companies often are valued very well, right? If you look at like on the stock market, well, exactly because of that stickiness, that lock-in, which is good for them, right? Maybe not good for you. That is the reason the Larry Ellison has such a big boat, right? Now, in this case, I think what is also interesting is the history lesson we have already in another industry transition. Now, if you wonder who is that young, good-looking guy, well, that is Mr. Larry himself. And what was Larry doing in, I think it was 80s? Well, it was saving the world from this dominance of a nasty big blue. They're not a sponsor, by the way, right? A nasty big blue, right, which had this really vendor lock-in, right? And you have to get things with expensive, what is well, big computer mainframes, right? Yeah. And then Oracle was this nice little database company which allowed you to exploit that. Well, guess what? Now, of course, it took a few decades, but now what do we talk about Oracle? Well, Oracle doesn't have customers. Oracle has hostages, right? So, here is another interesting slide. And this slide is actually from AWS marketing presentation a few years ago, right? Then you see like an even logo out there is old. Then they spoke about cloud as an electricity. Right? But what is interesting about electricity is it is commodity. You can use the same solutions, right? And like your laptop and any electricity provider out there. Well, that is also how we can use the cloud if we can use it in the right way. We can use a cloud as a commodity infrastructure provider and choose not to be addicted to that proprietary services. And that is what the Kubernetes, which I spoke about, really allows us, because Kubernetes is the universal API, which has become pretty ubiquitous. It's available at private cloud, at public cloud. You can take Kubernetes to the edge those days, right? And again, as it's not perfect, as you know, none of the technologies are, it is moving in the right direction. It has a great community. So you can pretty much choose, right? Either, you know, like you have AWS, which you have, you know, complete cloud vendor lock-in, right, and embrace all those very advanced proprietary services, or you can use the cloud-native stack, and you have create all the value with open source and so on and so forth. Yeah, and of course, folks, you understand the situation with Yandex Cloud is totally different. It's nothing like AWS. Yes, that is also another interesting, maybe kind of zoom in with a picture of cloud-native landscape. And I think what is interesting in this case here, right, compared to Amazon, it's maybe kind of even too big. It's maybe even fragmented. For many things, you'll have not one, but maybe like 5 different solutions, right? And I think this is not a bug, it is a feature. It is a feature of the open source movement when we often sort of like allow multiple flowers blossom, right, and then something wins, right? Solutions kind of sometimes join forces together, you know, sometimes the best things win, so I think that is fantastic. Now, if you look at Percona, what we'd like to see? Well, we would like to help to create their public database, Amazon-like, right, or whatever, like database as service experience without no vendor lock-in. You can already get some of the stuff with Kubernetes directly. And again, like I think if you, like here's a link to one of the tutorials I created. And if you haven't ever played with Kubernetes, you will be surprised how easy it is to do certain things, which takes you, a lot more if you just, install things classically on VMs. So that is done, of course, through the Kubernetes operators, which is a state-of-art solution how you deploy natively stateful applications like databases in Kubernetes environment. And also in our solution called called PMM, Percona Monitoring and Management, we actually have an interface also to deploy and manage databases on Kubernetes. So it's kind of the database as service solution with your bring your own Kubernetes environment. It's still in development, but we still would encourage you to check out, provide your feedback, or other things open source, so you can also contribute the code if you like. So to give the summary of what I just spoke about, well, I think the open source database are very much on the path from being just running containers to becoming more and more ubiquitous in Kubernetes. And I expect beyond Percona, there will be other solutions to provide the graphical user interfaces and more simplified API to deploy and manage databases in that cloud native stacks. I know some other companies are working on the similar solutions as well. What is also important with open source, you can always be part of solution. So if something doesn't work yet, you have the full opportunity to make it work for you. You just need to take that responsibility on yourself and not expect just to other people make it happen for you. Well, the database as a service have I think many hearts, and it's growing very rapidly because of really that unparalleled convenience, right, which we are all suckers for. At the same time, the vendor lock-in sucks. I truly believe that, and that means, as usually, the open source is coming to the rescue. Couple of other announcements, right? If you guys like the open source and databases, we have Percona is doing the free event tomorrow. So if somebody is staying in Belgrade still, then you feel free to drop by either for a full day or for just presentations you need. You can get more information about Percona stand. And also, I think this one, yeah. So the organizers forced me to include this slide, right? So voting is important. So if you guys thought that this was the most amazing presentation you ever heard, please go ahead and vote. If it was a, stupidest thing you ever heard, please don't. Okay, well, that's all I had.
Thank you very much. Let's ask questions. We're running. It's not a high-load song, though.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Anton. I work in YDB. I was wondering, how do you help your customers who use DBaaS deployed on their own hardware with capacity planning? Because when you go to the cloud cares about enough servers and enough storage for your databases? What do you recommend to your customers?
So how do we work with customers who want database service, right? Well, there are actually, well, obviously like free ways, right? You can use like one is you can just, take an open source software, run it yourself, you take a full responsibility, right? The second one, you can say, hey, you know what, we still want to operate yourself, but you want to do it with help, right? Then you essentially subscribe to our support services. And then they also have a managed services, right? We can say, well, you know what, we will own the database as a service, right? It's in our environment, but where Percona staff will be able to resolve exactly what problem you're speaking about, right? And we just, keep things running.
One more question.
Thank you for the speech. My name is Vladimir. Is there any solution to support multi-tenant database in multi-tenant Kubernetes clusters like OpenShift? As I remember, I tried to use operator Percona, but it assuming to use only one database instance in high availability, great solution, but not suitable for multi-tenant cluster.
Yeah. So well, so if you look at in a Kubernetes, right, an operator, well, even you can deploy multiple database instances, right? In this case, so multiple database clusters, right? That's one of the way. Now, what you can also do is what we even have support for operator deployed in a single Kubernetes namespace, right? Then you can use different namespace for multiple tenants, right? That is a second choice. Well, and of course there is this third choice, right? Because the tenants and database are so kind of overloaded term, right? You also may have a single cluster, right? Where you essentially just create, different users or set of users, and they use a different database or schemas, right? These are 3 different choices.
Thank you. More questions? Over here, please. More questions, guys?
Thank you for presentation. I'm just wondering, and it could be curious, but I'm just wondering why we should use your open source solution, for example, for MySQL, not open source solution for MySQL.
Oh, okay. Yes, yeah. Oh, look at that. You guys are just giving me so good questions, right? I didn't bribe anybody yet, but I think you'll have an opportunity with a prize, so keep those coming. The thing is this, right? If you think about the MySQL, right, we like to call it's open source. It is actually open core. That means that the open source is sort of like a crippled version, which doesn't include some of the features, right, which is only included in the enterprise version, right, and which typically have to something to do with, security, scalability, right, some other things. In the Percona server for MySQL, right, we have those features, right, similar to them, implemented in open source, right? So that is one of the differences, right, of Percona server for MySQL. We also had done some other unique features, right? For example, we have support for MyRogs, like RogsDB, right? That is an engine Facebook uses to store the data, which often allows you to get like more compression, right, and increase efficiency. Well, you told the question was, as I understood it, why should you use Percona stuff instead of MySQL community version? Well, because MySQL community version doesn't have the same features as Percona server for MySQL.
You can always pretend you have a second question, get the mic, and ask it again. Or rephrase.
Yeah, or you can ask me later, right? I would be happy to clarify.
Thank you, Peter. I know you definitely know the answer. You say MySQL, and some speakers say MySQL. What is the correct?
Oh, what is correct, Walt? Well, I think if you know, like originally MySQL, it came from Sweden, right? Finland, right? So we used to call it MySQL at that time. Now, with American stuff, that's often like MySQL, right? So both of them are correct, right? But why you wanted to be it like a MySQL? You remember this song about YMCA? So you can see like MySQL, right?
Yes, I always thought that your sequel is your second startup that didn't really go well. And that's more of a sequel, or the second wife that you
Oh,
still...
yeah, sequel. Yeah. Good. Yeah, so you're getting that, English jokes.
Yes, that's when you're cinema-minded, not MySQL-minded. Questions, please. More questions? Jokes, songs, memes. So,
Oh, yeah, there's a guy out there, you see?
Thank you.
Yes,
Just when he wanted to get rid of me.
thank you for the interesting report, and thank you for your great product. You good very job, thank you. And my question was, do you continue work to provide operator for different products, for example, PMM, ClickHouse, and so on?
You want to provide what for PMM ClickHouse?
As a Kubernetes operator for the different products.
Okay. Well, so if you think about, there's like a little bit of a difference, right? So if you think about PMM on Kubernetes, right? Yes, we are working on that. So there will be, operator for Kubernetes at some point. Now, when we speak about like other database solutions, right? That's also eventually we will get it expanded. Right now, we see like a lot of focus for us as to really those like a free database because, well, we believe in doing it well or not doing it at all, right? And really, with all, I think, a transition going in their marketplace, right? There is a lot to do just to do those free databases as well.
Thank you very much. And a final question, and then we'll try to decide who gets the prize for the best
my name is
question.
Pavel. Are Kubernetes database operators really production ready, or what they are lacking?
Yes, well,
comparing to DBaaS databases. Service.
Yeah. So what I would say this, right? If you look at Kubernetes operators we have, right? We have them used successfully by pretty large companies, right? Which is, I think, more important than just assessment of our development teams. But I think it's what is important. What as things change, right? Like what you can and cannot do also changes. Right? If you, maybe some of you have been going with like cloud transitions, right? Well, not all the databases were very easy to move from bare metal to like a cloud VMs easily, right? In this case, it did. Same applies here, right? I would say if you have like a very large databases, probably may not want to do that because their optimal size of a node, right, or pod in Kubernetes is generally smaller than what you can do on the bare metal, right? Like I would say as an example. But if you understand where all the what nuance of Kubernetes comes, right, then it's can be run quite successfully.
So Peter, who gets the prize for the best question?
Oh, who's the guys? Well, now I have to put my ex-CEO hat on.
If you could wave.
Yes. And there was this wonderful person who asked the questions about how to pay per corner money. Yes, so that gentleman right there. Yes. You are. You ask a question, how do you pay per corner money? That is a very good question.
It's nice when you get royalties from people who run Yandex database. Yes. It's a person from YDB.
YDB. What did you say?
Yandex pays you royalties by asking you how to bring your money.
Ah, I see.
We were not supposed to discuss it with microphones.
We're not supposed to discuss the money front? Oh, yeah, I know. We should do this, at some places we say, well, it's not a bribe, but it's a gift, right?
Royalties, yes. Right.
Okay.
See, Slavic nations didn't know anything about royalties until just now.
Ah, okay, got it. Well, anyway, yeah,
So,
that
yes,
gentleman
if you
right
could wave
there.
to the helpers. Thank you very much.
Yes, gets a gift.
So,